Welcome to the Balance Sheet, where you rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. Last year, ChatGPT became the fastest adopted software of all time. AI became the word of the year. And we've seen AI go multimodal with images and videos. It's all really very fun, but what are enterprises doing with AI? Today, we have not one, but two guests who can tell us a bit more about this. First, we have Imogen Palmer, legal counsel at Google Cloud. She's an AI specialist and also a current EMBA student here at Cambridge Judge Business School. Welcome, Imogen.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We also have a Cambridge MBA alum, and he's also an ex-Googler, Faisal Sultan. He is CTO and co-founder of Atria.ai, which empowers legal professionals with advanced AI. Welcome, Faisal.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Let's start with understanding how both of you found yourselves in the AI field. Imogen, why don't we start with you?
Sounds good. So I trained as a lawyer, I think about 10 years ago. And I remember I qualified into the technology team at my law firm and quickly realized that AI might be quite a big deal. This was well before the generative AI wave and everything like that. But I remember doubling down on AI and kind of beginning to advise clients on how they were going to start thinking about, procuring AI and framing it. And then I moved from private practice to an in-house role in Google Cloud a few years back. And from there, it's really just been all about AI nonstop. So I was product counseling during the generative AI wave last year. And so I advised on the launch of Google's text-to-image model, invisible watermarking, and a few other products that we brought to market. And nowadays, I have more of a hybrid role, and I work on a lot of the high-value commercial AI deals that we do at Google, and also a regulatory point of view as well.
Thanks so much, Imogen. And before we go to Faisal, just a shout out to Rob Hall, who's watching us from London. Rob is also an MBA alum, so thanks so much for joining us, Rob. Faisal, over to you. How has your career developed to this point where AI is part of that career?
Yeah, thank you. So I started actually when I did my degree. So I studied engineering. I did my master's project on speech recognition systems implemented using Bayesian algorithms on low-powered analog electronics. And the idea was being able to create neural networks using very low-powered systems. And then 20 years later, it's all coming back circle again because that seems to be quite a hot topic. So I started back then. I then worked at BP Oil Company working on deterministic systems, did my MBA, and then joined Google, where I was a program manager. I managed a large team of engineers, and we built solutions to automate our financial processes using a number of technologies, including AI and ML. And I built the first machine learning system within finance to automate a contract review process. And this was using machine learning models where we had to train the model and then implement them in a workflow. So yeah, I was doing that for a number of years. And then I left last August because a great opportunity arose to start my own company, something I've really wanted to do. So I met my co-founders, Vicky and Ruben, and we got together and we started a legal tech company. We've been going since November last year. And we've made really good progress. So we have a few customers now. We have product. We have a tech team. We're on the Slaughter and May incubator, and we're now announcing our seed round as well. So it's been quite an exciting journey since Bayesian algorithms implemented on analog electronics all those years ago.
Wonderful. And before we get into some of the questions and discussions, just wanted to state that Imogen is here in her personal capacity. She's not speaking on behalf of Google, and anything she says is not should not be construed as reflective of Google's position. So let's get started. Imogen and Faisal, it's been bit more than a year since ChatGPT 3.5 got released. The AI hype train pulled out of the station, it's escape velocity. It's now 2024. People are now wondering if we've passed peak AI hype. So, Imogen, what are you seeing in terms of company use cases for AI?
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, we've seen a lot of companies just spending the last year just getting to grips with what the tech is, what it can do, and really playing around with it. And I think the way it started out is, as you say, there's this kind of big hype up, and people think, oh my God, this is going to solve all of my problems for my business. I want to use it for a billion different use cases. And actually, you need to kind of sit and just think a bit more strategically around where can I put some resource to start playing around with this tech, but to use cases that, number one, are quite low risk, but have high reward in terms of, leading to more efficiencies in your business or, cost savings or however it's going to help your business. So we've reached that point of now people looking at it in a much more strategic way. And from that, I'm seeing a lot of use cases coming out, particularly around generative AI search capabilities, which are very easy to kind of plug into existing workflows, and also chatbots, things like that, as well as code generation, which I think has got a huge amount of potential and is very exciting.
Faisal, obviously you work a lot with legal clients. What kind of use cases do you see over there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. So our platform is designed to automate manual processes at scale. And so we build a number of modules according to what customers need. And we're very much focused on transactional processes. So these are high volume, thin margin type of processes. So for example, in the legal space, we're able to generate reports that need to be filled out and then entered into forms. Another example is we're able to identify dates within court orders and be able to send calendar reminders. So it's kind of things that we're able to do now that we couldn't do a year ago with the introduction of generative AI. Where we're not seeing much uptake is the use where it is very low volume and high value activity. And it's not because there's no financial incentive to do so, it's because there is a risk management element to it. So these systems are stochastic. And so there's always going to be a margin of error when it comes to the output. And so what we're seeing with customers is that they don't necessarily trust the output. And so there is a risk element that they have to manage. So they're not very comfortable with doing certain type of applying generative AI to certain processes. But the demand that we're seeing is in these transactional type of processes where it is high volume and thin margin areas. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing within the space of law.
Could you just explain very quickly what is a stochastic process?
Yeah, it's a stochastic system that's based on probability outcomes, right? So a deterministic system is when it's very much Boolean type of logic, where if one thing happens, then you should do another thing. Whereas stochastic output is where the output is based on probabilistic nature. So it may happen, it may not happen. And so this is the problem with large language models, in that you cannot really depend on the output. You cannot guarantee that the output will be one way or another. They might be 99.9% accurate, but there's always a chance that it could be wrong. And it's because they are based on statistical models, essentially. So that's what I mean by a stochastic system.
Imogen, do you see this lack of 100% guaranteed predictability an issue for some companies when maybe at the end they're asked to explain how they came to a particular decision, but it was basically it was the AI? Do you see that as an issue for companies?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that companies need some clarity on, right? You do need that ability to kind of look into the black box and see why the output has been generated, the logic that's gone into that. So it's definitely top of mind for a lot of companies, and it factors into a lot of the principles and even the regulatory landscape that's coming down the track as well. This idea of transparency and explainability.
I'm guessing that most companies in the world, they're not going to develop their own foundational models or large language models. They're going to go to a supplier, whether that's Google, whether that's Atria.ai. So, Imogen, can you just say what are some of the things that clients or companies should be asking their suppliers about when they start this AI journey?
Yeah, so I'd say that the biggest question that gets asked, and it's kind of an umbrella question, is what is your approach to AI governance? And then within that, there's lots of different areas you really need to kind of double click on. So AI governance in a kind of overview way is normally, are you adhering to a set of principles and practices that mean you're using the AI and training it in a responsible, like legal way? So there's been a lot of kind of worldwide convergence on this, which is positive. Before we got to like regulatory stages of things like the EU AI Act, we had like principles, like different countries had their own AI principles. The OECD had its own AI principles. And the idea behind all of those was to focus everyone's minds on what is important when deploying AI. And those covered things like, as I said, transparency, explainability, a human in the loop kind of thing, making sure you mitigate any unfair bias in your data and your training data and fine tuning, robustness and security, because of course, in order to use this AI, you're pooling a lot of sensitive data and IP often into one place. So that security aspect is really important as well. And then as well as the governance piece, you want to know how accurate the model is going to be, as you mentioned already. So you want to know its likelihood of hallucination and if there's any tools that you can implement or that have been implemented already to help mitigate against that. So also very important. And then in the enterprise space, a quite common stumbling block I come across is kind of confusion about whether the off-the-shelf model will use your data to improve the model. So in the enterprise world, that's an absolute no-no. You can't be doing that with customer data. But in the consumer world, it's a kind of different story. So a lot of the time is really driving clarity on that point as well. And then lastly, quite an interesting aspect of this, which has come up more and more recently, is around the sustainability part of training models and the data centers, then the power required to train a model and then cool the data centers, from all the heat that's generated is quite huge. So I've heard there's a lot of questions now coming as the conversation matures around, okay, are you training your models in a sustainable way? Because, I think Sam Altman is now pointing to like nuclear fusion as the only way we're going to be able to continue powering the data centers to train these models at the rate we're trying to. So that's another really interesting angle to this that I don't think gets talked about enough.
Well, I think Sam Altman was asking for $7 trillion, right? Some ridiculous sum like that to continue the development. But there you go. If people have questions, just post them in the comments field. And we had one question from Godwin that he posted before this. And maybe Imogen, if you can talk about how can organizations proactively embed ethical principles into the fabric of their own AI development and deployment?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the $1 million question. So I think it comes down to, having those upfront conversations with your vendor if you're procuring a foundation model off the shelf, which you probably are going to be, and then making sure you set up good practices internally. And what that means in practice is, documenting any fine tuning you do to the model, like sanitizing your data to make sure it's of good quality, having kind of regular like risk reviews to ensure that you're using the model for appropriate use cases, and really have a kind of regular cycle that you're going through with each new kind of use case you point the model in, I think is important to make sure it's a kind of ongoing process rather than a one-off.
Faisal, what have you been seeing with your clients? Have you seen them bringing in these AI ethical principles as they discuss use cases or applications with you?
So the main consideration, as Imogen pointed out, is data privacy and security. So what they do not want is their data to be leaked outside of infrastructure. They do not want their data to be trained on other AI models. So we're dealing with very, very sensitive data. So contractual data, data related to individual cases, going through the law courts and those type of things. So the considerations that we have is around how do we protect that? How do we create a walled garden such that the data isn't leaving? And so the way that we control for that is, one, we use cloud infrastructure, and our product is built on Google Cloud Platform, but also we consider on-prem solutions as well. So how can we build infrastructure such that the data is secure within that infrastructure? Those are the main considerations that we're seeing from clients at the moment.
Yeah. Faisal, you've got written in your own personal Substack about when companies should consider on-premise models versus proprietary ones. Can you tell us very briefly what is the considerations, what are the differences between those two?
Yeah. Thank you. So we were working with a German manufacturing company last year. It was a conglomerate, and one of their subsidiaries manufactured nuclear submarines. And so for them, having cloud infrastructure is just, you can't consider it. So they have zero tolerance for any data leakage, any risk at all. So they needed to have their own infrastructure, and they wanted to use large language models to apply on their manuals for a very basic Q&A type of system. So they can't use cloud infrastructure. They have to have it on premises, and they would want to use a large language model, but they can't use OpenAI or Gemini because those are hosted on the cloud. And so there they would need to have a large language model on their own premises. And what's available to them is open source models. But the kind of considerations there is that, these models, people can inject bias into those models. And so one of the things they have to think about was actually building their own models, but then what kind of data they use, and will they have the same reasoning capabilities as these proprietary models? So there's a lot to consider about having on-prem solutions. I think this is something that's a lot of law firms will start to consider as well, right? Because their data is very, very important to them. It's client data, and it's very sensitive. And so what we're having conversations about is how can we use open source models on their own data, and they start to own those large language models, and it's hosted on their infrastructure. And what we have to consider there is costs. So it's not only the development costs, but it's the maintenance costs, it's the infrastructure costs, and it's the data acquisition and training costs as well. So there's a lot to consider when building out on-premise solutions. I do think that there'll be a combination of on-prem and proprietary models to create systems that will have specialist tasks in certain areas. So I think a hybrid approach will be commonplace coming up soon.
Yeah, and certainly something I've seen is often in like the public sector, you have governmental organizations that want to make sure that they at least have a hybrid approach, right, where they can ensure their data is at least stored in a particular location or country or region. So that's something I'm seeing as well.
Great. And we've got this question from Dan Bolzer, who asked, if we use an off-the-shelf model to provide client services, where does liability start or end? We're passing confidential client data to ChatGPT via, let's say, Azure, and then somewhere along the line, someone gets hacked. Who's liable? Are there insurance providers who can cover this liability?
So I haven't come across any specific insurance, but I could be totally wrong. I'm sure that there's data loss that occurs all the time, so I'm sure it's something you can insure against. But from a liability point of view, it kind of depends the circumstances under which you got hacked. So if it was, in this example, an Azure error where there was a gap in their security system or something that led to the hacking, then you'd probably have a claim against them. I should say none of this constitutes legal advice. But if you'd I don't know, had you'd behaved in a way that meant you'd used kind of corrupted data or something to begin with and put that on the cloud, then there might be an argument that you were responsible for the issue as well. So it kind of depends on the circumstances, I guess. But a cloud provider would have some responsibility, but you kind of operate a shared responsibility model.
Yeah, and Faisal, I assume when you speak to legal clients, that's one of the things that they always come, like who has the liability? Is that, do you get that conversation a lot?
Yeah, we do have insurance, so we do cover ourselves. Yeah, I mean, it's an absolute consideration. I mean, one of the benefits of going to the cloud to provide infrastructure is that they do have those considerations put in place. We are also ISO accredited, so having ISO accreditation also lends some confidence as well. And then the third tier is that we do have insurance in place as well. So it's those three-tier system allows us to give some confidence to our customers that we do have this managed, and it is a managed risk.
And then we have a question from Nikant, who's experimenting with running free Llama 3 locally on his laptop. Can he train it using NHS patient feedback without worrying about privacy concerns? I almost can guess the answer would be no, but is that right?
Again, not legal advice, but I would definitely look at what that feedback is kind of constitutes, because if it's got any like sniff of being personal data, then I would be very, very careful about using it. But I would also check the basis on which it's been licensed on the website, wherever you obtained it from as well.
I think if I go further on Nikant's question is, right now something like ChatGPT, right? It is so easily available. I paid, what is it, £20 a month for GPT-4. How are companies concerned that everybody basically has access to these tools, and it's so tempting to use company data? It may not be client data, it may be something else, and just type it into a prompt and get an answer, and then they use it in their work. Do you see companies being concerned about their employees having access to such tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was an article I saw at the start of the whole generative AI wave. I think it was some Samsung employees that leaked some confidential IP into a consumer grade version of ChatGPT, and obviously the model took it in and surfaced it somewhere else as an output. So yeah, it's again couching it in the fact, if you're using the consumer grade version of any of these foundation models, then yeah, you need to be very, very careful. And that's why the enterprise offering is so important, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Imogen was saying about the enterprise offering, and so that's the space that we are in, and that's why there is great demand, right? Because we do have a walled garden where information doesn't go out of the infrastructure. We can start to log the actual use of our product, and we can log the queries and log the number of tokens, and we can control the data that comes in and comes out. And so I think that's the way that enterprise is going to be able to control this type of usage. People are going to want to use it, and the demand is certainly there, and the productivity gains have been proven. And it's just a question of how does enterprise make it available to their users. And so products like ours, designed for specific workflows, is where that is how it's met, is how that demand is met.
Imogen, we've seen this current wave of AI. It's still very nascent, but obviously that hasn't stopped regulators from looking at the implications. At the moment, what are the major regulatory frameworks for AI?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a real patchwork across the world at the moment, I'd say, with the EU leading the way, closely followed by the US, and the UK is taking a more like laissez-faire kind of approach, and I think APAC similar. So I'll double down on what the EU is doing, really, because that is being touted as like the big bit of regulation that everyone is watching, and it's due to enter into force, I think, at the end of July now, maybe early August. So it's really coming soon. It's been in the kind of wheelhouse for quite a few years, and it's actually had to go through a lot of changes as the tech has changed so much since the first draft, which I think was 2020 maybe. So there's been a lot of time, and foundation models weren't really around then in the way they are now. So it's actually had to be updated for that as well. But in short, it aims to apply like a risk-based approach to different types of risky use cases that it deems either unacceptable levels of risk, high risk, or kind of minimal low risk. And then there's a kind of bolt-on section around general purpose AI models and what they call general purpose AI models with systemic risk. So the prohibited stuff is kind of all the really nasty use cases you might think of for using AI. So things like social scoring and subliminal manipulation and some kinds of emotion recognition as well. So those are going to be banned outright. And then there's a big chunk of the regulation that covers off the high risk AI stuff. And that is where it's going to get interesting, I think, because this hits a lot of sectors that currently do use AI. So it lists out a series of use cases in the Act that include things like credit scoring in financial services, education, employment, and law enforcement. So Faisal, I'm sure you're going to be quite aware of it as well. And it can be added to. And if something is deemed a high-risk AI system, then you are subject to transparency and disclosure obligations, evidencing you've got a risk management framework in place, and oversight and something called a conformity assessment as well. So there's a lot to do if you're in this high-risk AI system bracket. Then you've got the transparency requirements for the kind of minimal risk stuff. And that's where if there's any interaction of AI with a human, you have to have a transparency notice which discloses to the human that they're interacting with AI. And there's also some stuff around watermarking generated outputs as well. And then lastly, you've got the general purpose AI provisions, and those cover off all the foundation models basically that have come to the market quite recently. And this was really hotly debated in the kind of legislative process because different member states had quite different views about how much the law should aim to put pressure on the big tech companies basically around this. So where they landed is that if you are a provider of a general purpose AI model, you do have to do a lot of transparency disclosures. So that includes disclosing how you've trained your model, you're evidencing you've got a copyright policy, and also showing some technical documentation around the training and testing that's been done and the kind of capabilities of the model. So that's going to be really important. And then if you're a customer using the general purpose AI model further down the track, you're obviously going to rely on that information to meet your own obligations. And then if you meet a certain computing threshold or the commission basically decides so, you can be deemed a general purpose AI model with systemic risk, and that carries kind of even more obligations around security testing and red teaming and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a lot going on in the AI Act and a lot to think about, but fortunately it's staged compliance. So the first bit that comes into force is the prohibited AI stuff, so the really bad stuff, and then it kind of goes down from there over the next couple of years. So yeah, lots of lawyers being kept very busy at the moment.
Well, Imogen, you'd say lots of lawyers are being kept very busy, but when you look at companies, are they just throwing all this to the legal team? Are they throwing it to the IT guys, or are they creating new AI officers or to look into these issues?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is it requires like a really cross-disciplinary approach because a lawyer needs help from the technical teams to understand how the model is trained and the data it's been trained on and its capabilities and things like that. So it really does require like a lot of people in the room. And of course, as a customer, you're going to determine the use case of that model too. So it'll also depend on how you decide to use the model as to whether you fall into like the high risk or not, for example. So yeah, there's definitely it's going to need to be a group effort for sure to work through all of this.
And Faisal, when you speak with clients, are you speaking with the IT teams? Are you speaking with, the in-house legal team of a law firm? Who do you speak to?
Yeah. So we don't speak to IT teams as our initial conversation. our initial conversation is with tends to be the innovation teams within innovation teams within law firms, and then in-house counsel, senior leadership. So there's no concept at the moment of a chief AI officer as yet. The demand comes from those teams that have these very heavy manual processes that would like to use AI, and so that's who we approach, and that's who we're talking to at the moment.
And Faisal, I think when you spoke earlier about how a lot of these generative AI systems, they are all stochastic. You can't predict exactly what the output will be all the time. So someone on LinkedIn has asked, this move away from those very rules-based algorithms, it brings a new realm of identification, failure modes. So what risk frameworks have you found useful in building that set of controls within the organization?
Yeah, so there are three ways that we control for in case things go wrong, right? So the first one is building a system that grounds the large language model with context that is relevant to the query. And so this is a system that people might be familiar with, and it's called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. It's also known as in-context systems, where we take enterprise data, we break it down into series of chunks of text. We then compare it to the query that the user enters, and then we use relevant chunks of text as context into the model. And so that way there is some guarantee that what the output will be based on information that's provided to the large language model. The second way is by providing evidence to the user in a very easy to use experience. And so it's evidence and citation. So being able to look at the context that's provided into the large language model and is used to answer the question in a very easy to way by looking directly at the document. And so we've developed UX features in order to do that. And the third way is through workflow. So traditionally you have 2-eye or 4-eye checks. So when the output is produced, you have someone checking that output. Now there is a movement to actually use large language models to do that. So these are stochastic systems. So in theory, if you add more layers of these models, then the probability of an answer being incorrect goes down, similar with a human being checking it, right? So if you have more humans checking the answer, then you can guarantee the output. The problem with that approach is that not only can you get a better answer, but you could also get a more incorrect answer because it would amplify the bias or amplify the inaccuracies in the first place. So those are 3 ways that we can control for incorrect outcome. Firstly, by using the appropriate system. Secondly, by providing a UX so that people can check quite easily. And third is by introducing workflow into the system.
Imogen, anything you would like to add for this?
Yeah, I think from like my hat on, it comes back to the kind of AI governance framework, the kind of non-technical processes and checks you have on a regular basis, as we say, like built into your workflows, to try and identify if your model's starting to exhibit a lot of bias or something, so you can fine tune a bit further, or things like that are getting flagged up and addressed. You can take it out of production for a bit and sort it out. So yeah, you really just need to build that in from the start, as I say, beginning with whoever is providing your foundation model, and then kind of make everyone in the business that touches the model in some way kind of involved and aware of the process too.
I think, the 3 of us, we were probably in the AI enthusiast, optimist camp, but obviously when you bring it into a large organization, there'll be a lot of anxieties about the use and adoption of AI. Imogen, have you seen this happen in some companies, and how have companies tried to address those concerns?
Yeah, definitely. And what's interesting is kind of different sectors have approached it differently. So, for example, I've worked with law firms quite a bit as well, and there was initially a lot of fear from them, again, due to the heightened risk of the privileged information and the sensitivity and stuff. And now it's kind of crossed the threshold, as I'm sure Faisal's seeing as well, where the law firms are much more willing to get involved and start, using this. Whereas I think in financial services, there was already quite a lot of effective governance and risk mitigation processes in place. So, and they also have all of their data in generally in quite kind of an organized way. That means they can start deploying this quite quickly for a lot of easy, like low risk but high reward use cases. So financial services have been really going for it and really started moving on deploying this stuff, and also in things like retail, where again it's a bit lower risk. So I think it depends on the sector a lot of the time. But one thing I've definitely seen is this movement now to like, okay, we've had a year of playing around with this. Let's start actually getting things into production and start, monetizing this tech a bit more. So I think we're definitely in that phase now, which is really exciting. And yeah, I'm excited to see where it all goes.
Yeah, Faisal.
Yeah, I mean, I see both fear and opportunity. So initially, individuals within the organization are scared, because it will change their job. The extent of the change and the extent of the impact, we don't know as yet. And so what we're seeing with law firms in particular is, they're taking their time, they're doing trials, they're understanding how it could be useful. And then from those trials, they're then seeing, okay, where can it actually be used? We've just had an announcement that a big law firm within London called Ashurst has signed a very big deal with Harvey AI. And so we can see there that, okay, some law firms are embracing it. What we are seeing from law firms is that it's taking time and it's a slow adoption, not necessarily because of fear, but because of the risk management aspect that I alluded to earlier. For in-house counsel, there's a lot of demand because it is in-house counsel is a high cost basis for an organization. And so there's a real need to actually employ this type of technology to reduce that cost. And so they see it as an opportunity. So it's both sides of the table, both fear and optimism.
Yeah, and as part of that, I think the kind of upskilling of the workforce is where it gets really important, and also your kind of workforce on the ground, but then also the people sat around the table in the boardroom. There's this huge kind of educational and training piece that needs to go along with this, I think, to convert that fear into excitement and to get the subject matter experts using the tech themselves so they can actually start building with it. Because I think if you have a bottleneck with just your tech team, in the case of like a law firm, it's as soon as you get the lawyers really empowered to start building stuff themselves, I think, you're kind of off to the races.
Empowered lawyers, that's a scary thought. But, Imogen, you talked about the education piece. So I'm going to don the strategy 101 hat here and ask both of you, as, let's say, a company starts, goes out, gets a supplier to bring in an AI solution, an AI model, etc. How sticky is that in terms of the ability for this client company to be able to switch after 2 or 3 years? Is it easy to switch AI suppliers, or do actually these the nature of AI is it such that there's a high switching cost?
I'll take that answer first. So we build systems that use large language models, and actually the approach that we take is that we use the best model for the process. And so we use a hybrid approach. So we're not just using Gemini or Anthropic or OpenAI, we use a combination of all of those. So the switching cost between those models isn't very high at all. It's literally you change a line of code and you're using a new model. The switching costs come in around what cloud platform you're using, your business processes and your workflow, and your availability of data. And so it's going to be very hard for organizations to move from applications like ours to different applications that would potentially do the same thing. But it's very easy for us to move from one large language model to another. And these large cloud providers do that deliberately, right? They need to offer a number of alternatives rather than their own proprietary models, probably for regulatory purposes, but also as a recognition that different models bring different things to the table. And the flexibility is also a good way of moving to different cloud providers as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. Imogen, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of where we are at the moment in this amazing kind of tech wave is that the choice of the foundation models out there has really exploded. So as Faisal said, you're beginning to see certain models by certain providers are really good at reasoning and others are really good at, you know, logic and like mathematical calculations. It just depends now on, you know, which task you want to carry out as to actually which model you should be using. So that's great. And yeah, I think the reality is we're moving into a world where you won't just have one model for everything. You'll like shop around a bit. So that's going to be important around the foundation models themselves. In terms of switching providers, the Data Act, which recently came in, actually requires at least cloud providers to make egress from their platform much easier. So at least the company that I'm associated with, we don't charge like exit fees, for example. So that means it is meant to be a lot easier now to switch between providers, and that just, you know, promotes competition and things like that as well. So there's actually like a kind of legal requirement now to make it easier for people to exit from providers, a bit like, you know, switching bank accounts and energy providers that like we have here as consumers. It's a similar sort of thing.
Dan asks, is OpenAI making any money? But I'll come back to Faisal, because I think this question and what you mentioned there about the low switching costs when it comes to models, I guess the question will be, given the huge amounts going into these foundational models, etc., if the switching cost is low, how do you think, Faisal, they will change their business model so that they can get more value back to them? Monetary value, that is.
Yeah, I mean, it is starting to become commoditized, right? And it is a race to the bottom. I mean, within the last 6 months, OpenAI costs have come down something like 200%, something, you know, and it's crazy. And then all of these other model providers are having to reduce their costs as well. So your question is, where is the value, right? Where is the money to be had, and who captures that value? And I think there are two aspects to this. I think companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, who provide cloud services and who host these models, I think they're going to do very well, because it's not just the model they provide, but it's also the additional things in order to build systems. And that's what we're seeing now at the moment, right? So we're having to buy all of these additional services. And actually, the large language model is a small percentage of our costs. I do think value is going to be captured at the end consumer, at the enterprise level. So not only will we see the cost of operations starting to go down quite dramatically with the use of these large language models, there's a lot of opportunities in order to increase sales. What those opportunities are, we're not quite sure yet. But what we do know is that what was once unstructured data, and a lot of it has now become structured with the use of large language models. How you can use that to drive value is where the real excitement is. So even though as an organization we've started to work on commoditized processes and getting value from that and reducing costs, the real excitement is, okay, now that we have the data, what can we do with it? And I think that's where the value proposition is. And I think that's what's being priced into the market, especially with the cloud providers like Google and Microsoft, because those are the ones that are going to benefit from those end use cases, as opposed to just providing these type of commoditized services of these models. Even though they're great, you know, everyone's doing it, right? And there's a lot of models out there. So that's what we're seeing at the moment, and that's what my hypothesis is.
Yeah. Well, Faisal, when you come back to your MBA reunion, we can see what the Strategy 101 guys say.
Yeah, absolutely.
But thank you so much, Faisal, Imogen, for giving us these basic and very useful information, as all our organizations are grappling and figuring out how to make the best use of AI. And I'd like to thank all our viewers as well for your questions. The balance sheet will be back on the 5th of July, same time, when we'll look at green hydrogen. Is it all that it's promised to be in the climate revolution? So, till then, stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.